Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So we are working on Parshat Noach right there, and we've gone through the flood, and now we're having the reaction of human beings after this flood, and what lessons have they learned, and what lessons have they not learned, and here we see that the reaction to this, the tragedy of the flood on the part of Noah's subsequent descendants and the generations that eventually followed was, well, we're going to prevent this from happening again. And it wasn't a turning to God, it was rather trying to use whatever natural resources they could to prevent this from happening. So we're right here. Vahi benosam mikedem, and it was so as they journeyed from the east. Vayimtzeu bika, and they discovered a valley, be'eretz Shinar, in the land of Shinar, vayeshvu sham, and they dwelt there. So again, these words vayeshvu sham, and they dwelt there, in some ways, to use the technical term, is pleonastic. In other words, do we really need this? If it had just said they found a valley in the land of Shinar, wouldn't we have understood that they settled there? That's what they found, right? That they traveled and now they found a valley. So what is the significance of this vayeshvu sham? And that's what we're looking at. Vayeshvu sham, they dwelt there. Tanya, right? So we have a teaching, taught. Anshe Dor Haflaga, the people of the generation of the dispersion. Remember, we're talking about the time when God scattered the nations into different languages, right? That they all changed, they all started speaking various 70 different languages. Lo Mardu, the only reason they rebelled, in other words, rebelled against God, Ela mitoch svea, because they were satisfied. They had plenty. They had luxury. Shinemar, as it states, and here's the verse, or rather the words, Vayeshvu sham. They dwelt there. So now we're going to look at the significance of this Vayeshvu sham. The Ein Yeshiva, and this dwelling, quote, quote, that is mentioned here. Ela achila ushtiya. It refers to eating and drinking. In other words, and that is metaphoric for basically living lives of comfort and luxury and pleasure. That's achila ushtiya, having enough to eat and drink, having as much to eat and drink as you like. Ukemoshe katuv, and they give an example in Parshat Tikitisa, right? This is in the book of Deuteronomy. Oh, sorry, no. Sorry, forgive me. In the book of Exodus, Kitisa is the parsha that deals with the golden calf, and that's what this is referring to. Vayeshev haham. So there's that vayashav, right? That verb. The people sat down, le'echol v'shato, to drink, to eat and to drink, vayakumu letzachek, and they arose to make sport, to make sport. And before we get into the Torah Temimah, it is just such a sad commentary, and we've made mention of this before, is that when people don't have to struggle for subsistence or for livelihood, we turn to other kinds of ways in which to find problems and to have problems with what we're dealing with. And that's essentially what this is saying, is that they had enough. They were living in a time of peace. They weren't having to endure war conditions, etc. Their conditions were delightful. And instead of living in a sense of deep appreciation for the fact that they had these kinds of lives, they turned to do other kinds of things and to rebel against God. So, in
Hmm.
some ways, right, commentary on our times, I'm afraid to say. Near here we go, here's with Torah Temimah. It would appear. So, first of all, He's examining the fact that they're saying that since they dwelt there, that meant that they had plenty to eat and to drink. How does they dwelt there imply that, right? It would appear, kavanat ha'inyan, that the intention of this subject, the mefaresh, which explains the stam lashon yeshiva, that simply the expression of yeshiva, of dwelling, right? Lifa'amim, it sometimes indicates al yeshivat keva, that when it's talking about that, it's talking about permanent dwelling, a permanent state of dwelling. Ukamo, and this is an example, v'yirashta v'yashavta ba. So it says, and you inherit, and then it goes on to say, right? You will dwell there. So you're going to inherit it, and you're going to possess it, and then dwell therein. So there it's talking about a permanent state of dwelling. Ulifamim, but sometimes more al yeshiva arait. But sometimes it talks that term yeshiva also can refer to a casual remaining in a place, to be in a place just temporarily. Come on, and here's an example. Vayeshvu lechol lechem. So they sat to eat bread. So sometimes sitting, quote, is permanent sitting, and sometimes this word vayeshev has to do with just a temporary being there for a moment and then moving on to something else. And that's in Parshat Vayeshev, right? Okay. V'hachiluk bein yeshivot elu pashut. And the distinction between, or the difference between these kinds of dwelling or these kinds of sitting, literally, right, is straightforward. It's simple. Dehayoshev yeshivat keva, because when it comes to dwelling or remaining in a place permanently, right, keva, permanently, da'ato, in his mind, zechucha alav. In other words, he feels zechucha is like somewhat smug. Smug. In other words, feeling, but I think in this case, even though this was the application of verso that translated it as smug, I think in this case it also sort of means confident, right? He feels at ease. V'chofesh, right? And v'chofes, and he seeks v'rodef, and he pursues acharei tanugim, after pleasures, ukedome, and likewise. In other words, when you're feeling really settled and confident in where you are, etc., you start to look for entertainments and pleasures, things to give you pleasure. Velochen, and this is not the case, hayoshev yeshivat arai, someone who only dwells in a temporary state. And I think this is the reason why, if you think about it, I know that in Arabic culture, the idea of a nomadic existence is considered something of a very high spiritual level, because when you're a nomad, you realize you're not staying in a place permanently. You're going to have to move on, and apart from the inconvenience of actually moving, not being able to say you're there permanently is a significant thing. In a way, the reason it has a spiritual dimension is because if you think about it, our dwelling here in our terms of our living, right, being alive, is a temporary state. So that living as a nomad, it parallels in a deep kind of way and emphasizes an awareness that we're only here in this world temporarily. So anyway, going on, it says if the person is just there casually and temporarily, da'ato truda, His mind is preoccupied, limtso lo makom, to try and find makom, a place, the yeshivat keva, for some permanent place to occupy, to live in. And I think in some ways it's also, we're aware of it, certainly nowadays, in terms of renting where you live as opposed to owning where you live, right? The difference is significant from an emotional and spiritual and economic sense. V'acharei, and since she'af al pi rov ein mordin, because in general, despite the fact that most people, I think it means, ein mordim ela mitoch harchava, the reason they are rebellious, because they have a sense of expansiveness, they feel secure, they have a sense of security for Rav Tuva and the fact that they're experiencing such goodness. And that's when they're ready to kick back, right? Well, Mordin is to rebel. Kamosha Katav. Okay, it is written later on in in the parsha of Haazinu, right? Vayishman. This is a quotation from Deuteronomy. Vayishman Yeshurun. Jeshurun waxed fat. Jeshurun in this case is an ironic term for the Jewish people. David, you wanted to say something or ask a question?
Sorry, I'm still on mute. So is this saying that uncertainty is what keeps us in check? I mean, it almost sounds like it, in the sense that we if we get too comfortable, we're going to cause trouble. So therefore, we have to have a certain amount of discomfort in order to not rebel and not cause trouble.
Right.
And but then also that if that's the case, it also means that we can't achieve that comfort level, because every time if we achieve it, then where we've gotten to the point where you have security, you can you don't, well, all those things, you can't get the reward, because if you get to that point, you automatically, it sounds like you'll regress. So
Okay.
yeah, that's what it is. Yeah,
Okay.
anyway.
So let me clarify that. Let me just finish this verse. It's just one
Sure.
word, right? It says Jeshurun waxed fat, v'yivat, and kicked, right? The idea is that the Jewish people were finally settled in the land of Israel. They had a wonderful economy. They were doing well. They were prospering. And at that point, they decided they didn't believe in God and they didn't need to perform mitzvot. So now to address the issue that you mentioned. It's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. Being in a state of comfort and prosperity has two possibilities. The one possibility is the one we're talking about, which is that your sense of security gives you a sense of independence and not having to depend on God. There's a statement that says there are no atheists in foxholes, right? Or if you are aware of it, it can lead you to a sense of deep gratitude, a deep sense that all this stuff is not an entitlement. And that's a concept I must give credit to Lauren for introducing me to. And that is this whole idea of entitlement. And if you're not conscious of it, you can fall into it without even thinking
Hmm.
about it. And if you are conscious to realize that these are blessings, that these are all not coming because simply you exist. They're not things you're entitled to, but in fact they are coming from a divine source. It came to me very strongly that, let's say, the reason for the mitzvot, for performing mitzvot, including mitzvot as like kashrut, the essential dynamic behind them is, how do you express gratitude to God for these blessings? In other words, how do you say to God, thank you? Thank you from the deepest part of who I am as a human being. How do you do it? And the mitzvot are a way in which to do that, which includes things such as kashrut, which you're not doing it necessarily because it's going to keep you healthier or things like that. I mean, you could argue that there's a lot of salt in that diet, and maybe that's not so healthy. But the issue is, we believe that God gave us this Torah, and that this represents a source of how to express to God how grateful we are. And that's why having a sense of appreciation is such a powerful, powerful motivation to do things such as keeping the mitzvot. And realizing there are times when you're in a place where you can say to yourself honestly, how do I ever express sufficiently the level of gratitude that I owe? The truth is, to your parents, for example. I mean, your parents are the ones who gave you life in this world. How do you express your thanks to them? But if you have a sense of entitlement, if you feel that you're simply entitled to these things, then you wouldn't do it. And that's why, and that's what we're talking about here. In other words, the people of this generation of of where they were scattered didn't have that sense of appreciation, and didn't have that sense of how fortunate they were to have survived and to actually live lives of plenty and health and all kinds of good things. But as you can see, I mean, I just realized the connection of performing mitzvot and the sense of gratitude.
That helps. Yep.
It's a choice. It's a choice. And how, if I can use the word, how invidious the sense of entitlement really is. So, all right, let's take a look. So he just quoted this verse from Deuteronomy from Ha'azinu, and Yeshurun waxed fat and kicked. And Yeshurun, of course, Yashar means righteous, and sadly, maybe it's saying they were self-righteous. V'Iyin Brachot, he says there's further comments on this. You can check the tractate Brachot, page 32a. Lachen, and for this reason, Mefaresh, it explains, Shehayeshiva kan, that when it says about Vayeshev Sham, or whatever, let's see, I want to make sure I've got the right word, right? Vayeshvu Sham, right? That term there, Eina mimin yeshiva arait. It wasn't arait. It wasn't a temporary settling. She'im kain, because if this were the case, haya lo haya, im kain haya, because if this were in fact the case, lo hayu boatim, they would not have rebelled. They wouldn't have kicked. Ella yeshivat keva. But this is referring to a permanent settlement, a permanent state of dwelling. Umasmich, and it connects this particular verse here that we're reading. B'gzera shava. Gzera shava is a type of logical connection where it uses, it's one of the 13 basic logical principles of Rabbi Yishmael of how to interpret the Torah. And it is basically saying that when a word is used in one context and the same word is used in another context, you can learn from one context to the other, to the other. And so, since we know about this context regarding the golden calf, where it talks about Vayeshvu, it uses that word there, and there it refers, of course, to this ultimate act of rebellion, where after having received the Ten Commandments, they worshiped the golden calf, right? That we can use it in this context as well. Min vayeshevaham, in other words, the verse back in Exodus, the people sat down, right, or dwelled, vayakumu letzachek, and they arose to make sport. But basically, letzachek means, in other words, to show disrespect, right, to make, to mock, something like that. Desham mefurash, because there it is explicitly stated, sheyashvu le'echol, because there they sat down to eat, veshato, and to drink, umitoch hasve'ah, and from this feeling of satisfaction, kamu lutzachek, they then arose, they got up then to make sport. Ye'uyan sham beperush Rashi, and you can look there in that context in Exodus with Rashi's interpretation. And this would be it for today. Are there any other comments? But it is, in a way, a, something to reflect on in terms of today and how people are behaving, and to what degree our level of living in peace and in relative comfort and prosperity hasn't led to a sense of gratitude and observance. So, okay, I'm going to stop with that. I'm going to stop the recording.